Hi, and welcome to Eminent Americans. I'm your host, Dan Oppenheimer, pervy uncle of the contemporary American intellectual scene. One of the essays in my private canon of great essays that no one else seems to have read, or at least admit to having read, is philosopher Nancy Bauer's essay Pornotopia, which first ran in the winter 2007 issue of N+1 and then was included in Bauer's 2015 book, How to Do Things with Pornography. I don't talk much about my enthusiasm for this essay because, as you can guess, it's rather embarrassing. You can't really get into this topic of pornography, even if you're quoting essays in elite intellectual journals, without owning in some fashion your own relationship to pornography, that you have a relationship to pornography, and perhaps without forcing your conversation partners to at least briefly visualize some aspect of that relationship you have, which isn't something that I really want to put on someone else. So it's remained private mostly, but precisely because of that, because it's an area where, on the one hand, it's so infrequently discussed in a vulnerable, kind of non-jokey way. But on the other hand, as we know from the statistics, it's an experience that is incredibly widely shared. I really want to read smart people writing about what it all is and means. I think there's just a foundational desire of the nonfiction reader, of the intellectual reader, is I want my rather embarrassing and underanalyzed private experience to be illuminated by someone else, to sort of draw out the universal in the particular, etc. There simply aren't a lot of examples of that in this space, and so it's super exciting when you come across one of them. Bauer's was the best that I've read. So that was an exciting, and it was also exciting to read a new essay on the topic by today's guest on the show, novelist and critic Lillian Fishman. Fishman is the author of the 2022 novel Acts of Service, which was named one of the best books of that year by The New Yorker and deals a lot with sex. And more recently and more relevantly for today's conversation, she's the author of the essay The Front Page, What Do We Make of Our Fear of Porn?, which is in the most recent issue of The Point magazine. The essay is partially an examination of a recent book, Porn, An Oral History by Polly Barton. But more importantly, it's just a kind of exploration in the sense that Bauer's was of what we can learn about our sexual imaginations by looking at our relationship to porn, and also, what we can learn about culture and gender, patriarchy, power, the nature of sex, etc., all of those good things. What can we learn about them by thinking about the videos on the most popular tab on the website Pornhub, which is the most visited porn site in the world, which probably means it is one of the most visited sites in the world, period. That most popular tab piece of it is important because the project of the essay is to see what we can learn by analyzing not our most extreme and transgressive fantasies as they're dramatized in porn. That's the project of so much scholarly and intellectual analysis of porn, but rather what we can learn by spending time with our most normie fantasies, which of course contain elements of the transgressive and extreme, but also reflect fairly vanilla fantasies. They also just kind of reflect our anxieties and our cultural coping strategies and things like that in a really interesting way. So it's a really good piece. As I said, it was exciting to come across. Just to give you a taste before I get to the conversation, I just want to give a passage toward the end where Lillian is talking through one of the ways in which, she's talking about pain, and one of the ways in which the infliction and experience of pain in pornography has to be seen, at least potentially, as more than just an immoral and indefensible instance of misogyny and patriarchy. It may be those things in many of those cases. It is those things in many cases, but not in all cases. And also perhaps our desire to lump it into those categories, to dismiss it as simply immoral and indefensible, is to some extent a result of our discomfort with just the pain of being human and the difficulty of being sexual beings. So here's what Lillian writes. To allow someone to hurt us in an excruciatingly intimate setting is not so different from allowing someone to love us. Emotionally, the two are so entangled that we enter love knowing it begets pain. In its best forms, which porn attempts to evoke, sex is a departure from any codified or accepted form of social routine. We eagerly contort ourselves in ways we'd be humiliated for the general public to witness. We stretch ourselves emotionally and physically in order to have great sex. We push against the boundaries of comfort. We fear getting hurt. It's a commonplace that all the best things in life arrive at the edge of hurt as a result of risk. Why do we think sex is the exception? Why are we going around supposing that the prerequisite to good sex is feeling safe? This necessity of risk to the real profundities is, to me, why pain and fear are routinized elements of porn. This necessity of risk to the real profundities is why sometimes it arouses me to glimpse pain and fear when I watch people having sex, and at other times makes me shudder and turn away. I don't usually think that it's important to read the text under discussion before listening to an episode of my podcast, and I think this is a fun conversation regardless. I don't think you need to have read Lillian or Nancy Bauer, but it would be even better for you, the experience of listening, I suspect, if you've read the Lillian Fishman essay. I'll drop a link in the show notes as well as a link to Bauer's essay on the N+1 site. Anyway, I hope you enjoy. I hope it commingles pain and pleasure in a way that delivers some satisfaction. Peace. Lillian, welcome to Eminent Americans. You're hereby anointed an eminent American by the ghost of Andrea Dworkin.
I mean, if anyone's going to do it.
So, yeah, I asked you on after I read your piece, your recent piece in the new issue of The Point magazine, although by the time this comes out, I don't know how new it'll be. The title of which is The Front Page, What Do We Make of Our Fear of Porn? Can you describe to me, just sort of summarize what the argument is?
Yeah, the piece is a response, I guess, to this book called Porn by Polly Barton. It's a really interesting book. It's a Fitzcarraldo book that came out 2 or 3 years ago now. The book is a collection of conversations between this translator, British translator Polly Barton, and these set of acquaintances that she has. She worked abroad in Japan for years, so it's like a mix of Brits, Americans, Japanese, and Australian people that she's interviewing, but they're mostly millennial and Gen X. Basically, she realizes that she's really disturbed by conversations about porn and the sort of specter of porn, but she realizes that it's operating in this sort of very causal way in her dating life. She realizes that a lot of her perception of her personal problems, she relates in a sort of instinctual way to porn, but she doesn't have a way to talk about it. And so she writes this book where she transcribes her conversations with people about their relationship to porn. And I thought this was a great idea for a book. I was really on board with this project and I was really interested in it when people mentioned it to me. And when I read it, I was like, why is it that I'm getting such a bad vibe from this book? There's some fundamental disconnect going on here where she thinks that this book is trying to redeem the silence around porn and the shame around porn and make it accessible and sort of show how we can be interested in it. And at the same time, she's totally uninterested in it. And all of her questions and her orientation toward it is infected with fear. Some of the people that she talks to have a really sort of forthright, sophisticated relationship with porn and can say a lot of interesting things about it. But her orientation to me, it was very self-defeating in an odd way. And she's half aware of it. And I just was thinking about how much, especially liberal writing about porn is like this. It's all couched under the assumption that it's important that we have it and we have diversity of bodies in porn and gay people, queer teenagers can access porn where they see themselves reflected and we don't have a culture of repression. But at the same time, the underlying assumption is that everything that's actually available in this important sphere that we should let exist for free speech purposes is in fact toxic and alienating and destructive. I also realized as I was talking to my friends about it, I was like, I'm going to write this thing about how I think this is a sort of misguided liberal idea about porn. And they were all like, well, porn is really bad.
Right.
Everybody that my leftist friends that I talked to were like, well, yeah, of course, we can't outlaw porn, but porn does ruin young boys. The sort of knee-jerk assumption, even of all my smartest friends, was you shouldn't really touch this because what you don't understand and what we know from the data is that porn's killing us. Which I don't even necessarily dispute. I do think the internet is bad for teenagers on many levels.
Right.
It's just not what's interesting to me.
Was the reaction from your friends just that sort of sociologically or systemically porn was bad and it was producing kind of immature sexualities, particularly in young boys? Or did they also implicitly or explicitly share the kind of, I was going to say the moralistic judgment of porn, but I actually think, part of what I liked about your piece was, it wasn't just that you were sort of critiquing moralism. I think you were saying that, what was the term? Was the term tender sexual or tender queer or something that you borrowed?
Oh yeah, tender sexuality is from Ayala.
From Ayala, right? The sort of sex worker, writer, performer, that the implicit assumption or suggestion from a lot of people who surely, some people who do behave this way, but surely lots of people who don't in fact behave this way in their own sex lives, was that healthy sex, good sex, was this very sort of like cozy, safe, equalitarian thing. Or did you get that from your friends too? Or was it more like they were with you, like sex is a more complicated phenomenon, power is complicated, there's all sorts of issues around hierarchy and dominance and things like that. But let's at least acknowledge that the sort of industry of porn has like ill social effects.
It was much more the second. My friends are not moralizing about vanilla sexuality, but I do think those two stances, which like we're eager to say I'm in this camp and not the other, are like more connected than liberals want to believe they are.
Yeah.
You know, I'm sure that there really is a lot of ill that porn and porn addiction does to young people, because all types of internet addiction, it's not like I think the internet is like producing great habits in us. I just think a lot of the anxiety that we have about the actual content of porn is that it somehow implies hatred, denigration, the worst forms of objectification, which it sort of implies that like all the porn people learn to get excited about are these like really violent, degrading things that, you know, like if you watch enough of them are going to result in you like being a total misogynist and like shooting up schools. And, you know, I think that in fact, the truth about human sexuality that porn reveals is that like we do have a desire to treat other people as like anonymous objects, but we also, the imagination is also that like they like it, just like we like it, right? Like the fundamental fantasy premise, which Nancy Bauer does a great job with, is like not that we want to hurt people, but that like everybody wants the same thing.
The title of your piece is the front page, and that refers, at least most explicitly, to the front page of Pornhub, which I think is the biggest of the sort of porn sites. I assume by front page you just mean when you go to pornhub.com.
Yeah, or like the most popular tab. Because I think the front page is like algorithmically determined, right? Like if you visit the front page, it knows what you like. So it's like less reliable as like an idea about what's popular. The most popular tab is what I'm really interested in. I think that that is like sociologically rich.
You call it vanilla porn, but we have to be careful about what we mean by that word vanilla, because what it doesn't mean for you is safe, politically progressive, enlightened porn. You're just saying the popular stuff.
The underlying premise underneath the scene is that secretly everybody wants it.
Right.
Nobody's being violently raped. Nobody's being killed. Nobody's being truly manipulated. Like there's an ostensible manipulation, but in fact, the underlying premise is like we all want to get around the stifling social mores in order to have this thing.
What are the basic constituents of like most popular tab on Pornhub?
I think the categories are forbidden because there's a teenager involved, forbidden because we're with family members, although because of the sort of legal strictures on a site like Pornhub, they can't say that they're real biological family members, so they have to be step family members. They're always step family members, correct. Because it's family, because it's a teenager, then it's like because this person is loyal to your best friend or your roommate, you have some sort of relational problem. And then of course a big one is group scenario, gangbang, like we're in some sort of scenario where it's not allowed because you're like a huge slut for wanting to participate in this. You know, we're going to have to keep it a secret and pretend this never happened. I think those are the big categories. And I do think they're like fundamentally pretty vanilla. I know they're technically not. That's not what we mean by vanilla, but I'm saying I don't think that the implication of them is as violent as people think it is.
It's so fascinating because it's sort of one of the things you have to ask yourself, and you write about this really smartly, is, so this is what people want. There's certain things we can assume in knowing they want that. We know it turns them on, but we don't actually know if the fantasy that is being played out is precisely what they would most want to have in their own life. The fact that somebody is into like stepmother porn, let's say, doesn't mean in a totally literal sense that what their fantasy is to have sex with their stepmother or with a stepmother or something like that, right? There's some process of translation there, I think. Is that, I mean, am I right that that's kind of some of what you're saying there?
Totally. I mean, I think the actual population of people for whom these are literal fantasies is like vanishingly low. I think these are structures that create a sense of the forbidden. I guess another category that I feel like is less front page but evokes the same thing is like public sex, right? I don't think these are fantasies for that many people, at least not about their own step family members. I think that is, there's like vanishingly rare, you know? There's some good novels about those types, but like I don't think they're, who knows? I don't think they're that common in the population. But I think it's like, yeah, you want to watch, I imagine, from my browsing of the front page and the popularity numbers, which a lot of people analyze, right? I think that you imagine that you want to watch a scene in which you get a felt sense of they're getting away with something in the video. There's an urgency of desire that is measured by what it has to overcome. So if we just go into a room, which is also really popular in porn, it's just less interesting to me. But if we just go into a room that's a white studio in Hollywood where two actors get on a bed and they're both like, you're hot,
Right.
and they just start fooling around, which is like a big category of porn for the top porn stars. Like people do want to see this, right? That's like the true vanilla.
There's no taboo. There's not really much transgression. There's not danger. It's just two people who do this for a living. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really hard to overcome the assumption that like they're both just pretending to be into each other because they're being paid. Which is the assumption under all porn, unless it's true amateur, right? That's the assumption in a lot of these videos that have a taboo circumstance as the premise, but they're also, the premise allows us to sort of see the like machinations of trying to express desire, overcome fear, like these sort of much more palpable measures of how erotic the thing is.
It's such a complicated subject to talk about. Even I'm sitting here feeling complicated about it because we know that it's pervasive behavior, right? We know that most 80-90% of men consume porn at least once a month or something like that. And the numbers for women are lower, but they're not low. And so it's a sort of pervasive phenomenon. One of the things that you talked about a lot and was really interesting in your article was, the sort of differing perceptions of whether the women in porn are enjoying themselves, right? I don't think there's ever a perception about whether the men are enjoying themselves, though actually you could do that too. It's just it's not as sort of politically fraught a question. Like plenty of the guys in porn don't look like they're particularly enjoying themselves.
Yeah, we're just not as worried about it.
When you're talking about women not enjoying it, it's like, what do we mean by that, right? Because I don't think we necessarily mean, if critics of it say the women don't look like they're enjoying it. You could be talking about, the more sort of overtly brutal stuff in which they're like expressing kind of direct expressions of pain. But I actually think if you're thinking about the vanilla stuff, what you're really talking about is there's kind of an empty look in their eye, right? And it's very,
Totally.
and it's very mechanistic. It makes it hard to talk about it because like the acting is so bad. And so there's sort of questions about are we talking about the thing itself, or are we talking about the fact that the people who are performing it are just not very good at performing it? So what are we talking about when
this was the hardest part of the piece, and the part that went through the most edits is my editor being like, what are we talking about when we talk about this? Like, I agree. And it's because it's kind of too big for the piece. It's like a huge subject, right? Which is like, I'm not personally that interested in. I think people who are really interested in like performance studies are more interested in this than I am. But yeah, the question of like, where is the sort of line between performance and pleasure? I think something that's interesting about porn, even though it's also alienating, is that like there are a lot of moments where you glimpse that line. You see someone who's dead in the eyes have an actual moment of like being reached by something and really feeling it, and then it retreats again, or vice versa, like there's something starts with real edge and like interest, and then it becomes totally rote. Like you kind of see that line animated in a way that you wouldn't in like a theater performance as easily. Like it has this uncanny edge quality. What I've read about porn performance and heard them say, it is a job and it can also be fun, right? And so like there are a lot of clearly performances where like you're seeing someone do a job and that is like quite depressing, if not worse, right? Then there are these moments where like there's reality to it. Like a job can be something else. Like they can have a real sexual connection for a moment. That's like an impossible question. And like one of the things that is interesting about porn, if you find porn interesting, is to see that animated. And I think what's sort of boring is to be like, none of it's real. It's all acting. There's no porn that actually gets at what eroticism is. Nobody's genuine. Nobody ever has a real orgasm. Like, I don't think that's true. But it is quite fraught.
Right. Well, and I think, you're right in a way that it's kind of surprising how much of the critique of porn is kind of letting itself off the hook by making those kinds of assumptions, right? Making the kind of assumptions that the people in it aren't enjoying it, making the assumptions in a kind of uncomplicated way that when they're watching something that reads to them as exploitative or misogynistic, that the people who are experiencing it, precisely the source of pleasure they're experiencing is in the misogyny. And then the biggest lie of all, which I think is the part of the core of your article, which is that healthy, quote unquote, good people don't actually enjoy things that partake of those non-politically correct dynamics as well.
I mean, I do think that's the big lie. And there's an amazing couple of lines in the Nancy Bauer, right? The philosopher in N+1 that you sent me.
Nancy Bauer.
There's a couple of lines in it that I think are like so brilliant. I honestly thought we should read them. I feel like they're about
okay,
this.
yeah.
Do you mind?
I love that essay. The book it's probably worth reading, but that essay is by far the best part of it.
It's amazing throughout, but this part I was like, we have to talk about this because I feel like this really gets at it. Okay, it's a few sentences. No philosophical analysis of pornographic objectification will enlighten us unless it proceeds not from the outside, from the external standpoint of academic moralism, but from the inside, from a description of pornography's power to arouse. Such a description reveals that, within the pornographic mise-en-scène, there's no space for the concept of objectification. The world as pornography depicts it as a utopia in which the conflict between reason and sexual desire is eliminated, in which to use another person solely as a means to satisfy one's desire is the ultimate way to respect that person's humanity and even humanity in general. See, I think that's so amazing because she's doing two really radical things at once, right? Which is, on the one hand, she's admitting this is a total delusion. Like, the thing that's kind of dangerous about porn, she doesn't say it's dangerous, but I think it is the anxiety people have that porn is dangerous, the fear of porn, is that it is like a delusional reality. And the fear we have about teen boys who consume a lot of porn is that they'll mix up this delusional utopian reality for the real world, and they'll go into the real world and they'll assume that girls want to be treated in this way that the utopian world of porn allows, right?
Right.
But she's also doing a much more radical thing than acknowledging that, right? Which is to say, yeah, this is a delusional world, but in fact, it's not like a hellscape. It's like a utopia, because the fantasy that we have when we watch porn is not to harm people by treating them as objects, but to elevate them and worship them by treating them as objects, and to live in a world where we all have the same secret desire and we ecstatically get to experience it together. Like, that is actually
right.
The fantasy of porn, like the fantasy, and it's like it actually reveals much less harrowing things about humanity than people are afraid it does.
One of the things I was thinking of, in that form, it's actually an escape from all the ways that actual sex implicates people morally.
Absolutely. Well, that's one of the problems.
Right? It's like that the actual sex, actual physical interaction with people involves, and one of the reasons so many of us are so afraid of it, particularly when we're young, but even when we're old, is that there's harm involved, there's vulnerability, there's...
The stakes for miscommunication couldn't be higher.
Right. But in porn, it's all stress-free.
Correct. Well, in porn, right, people are transgressing, being greedy, being needy, miscommunicating, offending each other, and then the other person is like, thank God.
Right.
You know? Like, that's the whole premise of mainstream porn. Is that, like, you could act so badly, and the other person would be like, God, I've been waiting for you to act badly.
This is exactly what I wanted. Now let's go at it.
Exactly.
The other thing I was thinking as you were reading that was, and maybe I thought that when I was reading it this morning, was you're kind of doing what she said people should be doing, right? I mean, it's not personal, but it's about from the inside. What is it the thing people are experiencing?
Yeah, well, I'm interested in exactly the thing that she says we should be interested in, which is like, what is attractive about this? Like, we are relentlessly attracted to this thing, and like, it's so boring to just describe why we shouldn't be attracted to the thing. When has that ever been a compelling route through history, is to be like, this thing shouldn't be appealing? It's so misguided to me. Like, it's not like I don't think that people should be sounding the alarm about how porn can be damaging. I did this visit the day after the porn piece had come out to the public thinking workshop that The Point holds in Chicago for college students. And so I was sitting in on John Baskin's class, and we had a conversation about my work that touched on the porn piece because it had just come out and a couple of the students had read it. And one of the students was like, do you think you have a moral obligation to like acknowledge that porn is harmful? And I was like, yeah, I think maybe I would have that obligation in a world where no one had done it yet. Right. But I actually think In the world as it is, where like the only prevailing attitude from the left and the right, the whole intellectual scene, from the whole media scene, is that this is like this horrible thing that none of us should acknowledge being attracted to. And like, honestly, the only reason that we aren't outlawing it is because then they would make even more money on the black market or whatever. The whole, like, it's only logistics. That's the only reason that we shouldn't wipe it from the face of the earth, right?
Yeah.
Our legal logistics. You know, obviously in a world where everybody's done that, I was like, I actually think my obligation is like to do something more interesting. That's, in fact, the moral obligation. To pile on this bandwagon is somehow a fallacy. I don't know.
I don't know how to think about it. I never know how to think about obligations as a writer. I always think my obligation is just to be interesting. To myself, above all.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know how to properly integrate it. Like, I'm not saying that I'm like a pure art for art's sake thing. I just don't even know where I would start if I had to think about what my obligation was. I mean, not to be full of shit, right? So if you're going to write about it, don't be like full of shit in a moralistic way where you're just not being honest about what it is that's going on, or you're taking refuge in, sort of conventional thinking about it. I mean, that seems wrong to me.
No, I think if we have an obligation, which is not really a framework I buy into, but if we have an obligation, it's to like be frank about what we're really interested in. The thing that was tough for me thinking about this article, and not just in relation to porn, but as I was working on it, I was realizing that this is true of my whole orientation toward cultural criticism. And I wrote a little bit about it in the piece, and then I think I cut it. I think it got cut because it was like an aside. But I was like, you know, the thing that's always, that I'm always coming up against is like, I'm only interested in our attraction to things. I'm never interested in why things are bad. I'm never going to write about why something's bad. We like mostly expect cultural critics to write about why things are bad.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, it's not like I wouldn't review a book and say it was bad, because like when you're assigned to talk about something and you think it's bad, I mean, I said that I think this porn book is like kind of bad,
right.
But like, right. I don't think it's interesting to like look at a popular phenomenon and be like, and here's why this phenomenon is toxic. It's not even that I think it's simplistic. Like, I think there's a lot of value in that form of cultural criticism, and some people do it really well. They can elucidate what harm something speaks to in our culture and in our psyches in a really exciting way. I want there to be people who do that. But yeah, my interest is always, what's compelling about this? Why do we love this thing?
What I was thinking is, you're saying that, oh my God, you're such a Freudian. I'm assuming you're Jewish, just because like I'm saying.
I'm Jewish and I am a Freudian.
Yeah, I was like, I could have just said, oh my God, you're such a Jew, because it's like, I mean, I'm the same, right? I mean, I'm saying that with the greatest of, affection and empathy, like, but that is the sort of Freudian sort of paradigm. It's like, what are these drives that move us? What's under the hood?
And what could be more interesting than like where the drive comes from?
Am I right that in one of your, it was a Grantith or sort of roundup of, things you read this year that you loved? I think there was something, you had a few sentences on Janet Malcolm. I'm not inventing
Yes.
that, right?
No, you're not. I love Janet Malcolm.
And I was like, of course, because first of all, because she's the best, but also it was just, there's a shared sensibility there, which is like, she's a big Jewish Freudian, like the rest of us.
Well, I'm going to take that as a great compliment. Yeah, I think she's amazing. And I don't think of it as explicitly Freudian to be interested in why we love things, but it is. And I also think, right, a psychoanalytic perspective is like really not interested in one of the big themes in cultural criticism, which is how should the world be? How can we build a world that we want to be in? Like, that's really what the Polly Barton book that I'm dealing with and responding to is interested in, is like, how can we like have a shame-free world where we talk about porn and we can reconcile and redeem our relationship to it? I'm not interested in that at all. Like, I'm not trying to like build something hopeful. I'm just kind of trying to like get to the bottom of things as they are.
Well, and I think there's an intuition, or more than an intuition, also in sort of psychoanalytic thinking, that often the effort to impose that sort of wished for, that idealized world onto the real world actually produces more harm than good. It's not just a lack of interest, it's also a suspicion of what happens when you try and impose these sort of naive moralistic frames onto, the messy brew of human desire. And I don't think that the psychoanalytic perspective is one that like all desires should be totally liberated, right? All taboos should be lifted, all norms should be blasted open. I don't think there's a belief that that's possible. And so you get into a question with porn, it's like, well, I don't think we should totally ban it and like send people who produce it to jail. But I'm not sure the space that we're in now with ubiquity of it and the internet is actually the ideal social containment for it. Like I'm not, and whatever, we all want to go back to our youth. I'm like, back when I was a kid and it was like you could kind of get it, but you had to work for it, turn on Showtime at like 2 o'clock in the morning. And like that was roughly the right relationship to porn that we should have. And this is like too much or something.
That's how you feel. That's, by the way, the most interesting thing about the Polly Barton book, which you might want to read, is like, a lot of the interesting stuff is how did you first encounter porn? What was available when you were a teenager? What was your sort of material relationship with it? How did you get it? That's a big part of the like premise of porn if you're like over 35.
Not an interesting story at all now, right? It's like you went on Google and said like porn.
I mean, I do think materially it's not interesting because it's going to be the internet for Gen Z, but I do think everybody's first encounter with these images is very meaningful. There's one of my favorite books is this book, Simple Passion by Annie Ernaux. There's an opening page that is like kind of like its own forward. It's not meaningfully related aside from thematically to the rest of the book, that is about her first experience, the narrator's first experience watching porn on Canal Plus, which is, like a French cable TV network, I have to assume. She basically just describes like that nothing could have been more shocking than to see this. Like to see this union take place, which had this like grand mystery and this like impossible spiritual mysterious value growing up as a young human, right? Like to see this on TV was like a shock at a sort of level that's indescribable. And, then the last sentence of the piece is like, something that was once shattering to see is now as available as, I forget what she uses as a metaphor, like a movie poster. Like it's an amazing line. Like it was so shattering when she was growing up to glimpse this thing. And I have to say, I think that even though it doesn't have that degree of mystery anymore, it didn't when I was growing up. I still think like the first time you see that is shattering in a certain way. Like it doesn't really matter what medium you encounter it in. It is such a sort of foundational, even when you grow up in a porn saturated culture, porn helps you understand this, even if you've never encountered it, right? That like what you're seeing is like secret and shameful and hidden. And like you're not supposed to do it in public and you're not supposed to see it. And that makes the revelation of it enduringly shattering.
Hey, so this is the free teaser. If you want to hear the whole thing, you know what you have to do. You have to subscribe, at least for this month, and send some moolah my way.
Now that everybody's here.